So the panel that we have here, and I'll make very brief introductions, is dedicated to campaign finance. However, those of you who heard a prior panel about political parties know that a lot of that discussion was about party financing. We're going to have a little conversation about that, but we're going to broaden it out so that we're talking about campaign finance in a number of other respects. But before I begin, you have, of course, the brochure with you, and you know that we have a very distinguished panel. On my left is Sam ISSACHAROFF at New York University Law School. He's a very noted constitutional and election lawyer who's written widely in the field, and I recently had the pleasure of hearing him deliver a lecture on party financing, campaign finance, contemporary issues, and particularly the struggle between parties and outside groups at the University of Houston. On Sam's left is David Donnelly, who is the president of Every Voice. He is a noted campaign finance reform advocate. He's been involved in money and politics issues for 20 years and has done extremely interesting work with considerable success that doesn't normally get noted at the federal level in the debate about campaign finance in the state and local jurisdictions where his organization has been very active. So we'll hear about that, and that's an important and oftentimes omitted part of the story. And on his left is Rick Hasen. Anybody who knows anything about election law, who practices it, who writes about it, who thinks about it, follows it in large measure through the writing of Rick Hasen. His 2016 election cycle output on this subject in newspapers across the country, the New York Times, Slate, I can't begin to name them. His scholarship, his well-known blog, the Election Law blog, all of that has marked Rick out as probably the most prominent commentator on federal campaign finance and other election law issues in the United States, and he is a professor at the University of California at Irvine Law School. So with this group, I'd like to begin by just broadening the subject out. So Vice President Biden earlier today opened up the conversation by saying briefly and then not continuing that he thought there was too much money in politics and he thought it was corrupting. And earlier, there was some discussion on the prior panel that the evidence about how much corruption or not corruption there is associated with political money was at best mixed, and certainly some of our panelists thought virtually non-existent. So let me begin with you, Rick, and then I'll move down the row here. Are we at the end of the Buckley view that money is corrupting in politics in the sense that it is so evidently and clearly a corrupting influence that we really need to continue to fight for significant congressional controls on campaign finance if we can get a court that will allow it?
So I think the question is whether or not we're seeing with the latest campaign, a transformation of our campaign finance system, a bifurcation of our campaign finance system, or it was a blip. So. And I think we don't know yet. Someone on the last panel said, I think it was Ben Ginsberg, in the middle of something, it's very hard to figure out what exactly is going on. So what we had with the Trump campaign was a celebrity-driven campaign run through social media that went around the traditional institutions and the traditional mediation by the press and others. And it's a question of whether future campaigns are going to be run in this way, whether we're going to have a Kanye campaign in 2020, whether we're going to have a series of celebrities, the Oprah campaign, and that this is going to be the new model. And if that's the case, what's the role of money? Well, we might say, well, money didn't matter for Trump. But to start off with, Trump did put $66 million of his own money into the campaign. And he did, in the end, not only court the super PAC donors, he also, when he started his transition, he literally gave a seat at the table to Rebecca Mercer as one of the big super PAC donors. So it's very hard to know whether this was a transformative campaign, whether Trump is just an asterisk, as he might be on questions like the party decides and questions of the accuracy of polling, or whether we're going to see a bifurcation. And what I mean by bifurcation is it may be that the rules for the president, because there's so much free media, someone said it was $2 billion worth of free media given to Trump during the last election cycle, whether for president, money's not going to matter in the same way. But for all of the other offices, money is still going to matter. And if you look at the Senate races You look at governors' races, the role of outside groups and super PACs. Wealthy donors are having ever more influence. So to get back to your question, I've never thought that the corruption issue was the main issue. I think that the court still will talk about it in that frame, and I've argued that that's a mistake. I think the real problem is one of economic inequality, and I think it's something that we're going to see whether social media and these new celebrity kind of campaigns changes the equation or simply shifts the money into social media, digital advertising rather than television, and we'll see the same patterns. I think it's very hard to say at this point.
David? So I guess I would argue that what you just described, Rick, that the growth of inequality both in our economic sphere and our political sphere is a version of corruption, that the process is corrupted so that some people have more of a voice than the rest of us. And so when you think about Rebecca Mercer sitting at the table, that's not the voters that Joe Biden was talking about listening to. Right? And so when we think about a corrupted process, we think about some people having more access than others, that results flow to those that are at the top and not to the rest of us. I think that is still a version of corruption. I also think that when we think about solutions on these matters, we need to move more towards a question not just about dealing with that corruption, but dealing with participation. So that the answer to these questions isn't about getting the money out or stopping the wealthy from having all the power or having influence. It's about increasing the influence of the rest of us and changing the organizing principle around these types of questions around money and politics to one of encouraging more people to get involved in the process through incentives, through incentivizing small donations, incentivizing other ways of participation in the process, and that's going to be the antidote on a policy matter. But I do think that inequality is a version of corruption because of the policy outcomes. And to the other point, yeah, absolutely there is a paradox that in the race that we all know the best, money matters the least. It's because we all know it the best. There's a tremendous exposure for presidential candidates, and you just need to have enough money to be able to get your message out, but not saturating everything. There's a reason why Mitch McConnell was raising $25 million in the last week for independent expenditures for Senate candidates around the country, because they knew that they needed to pour that money in to pull out some very tight Senate races around the country. And as you go even further down the ballot at the state and local level, money matters a tremendous amount. It's a tremendous impact that outside spending and candidate fundraising has on race outcomes.
Sam? Can I have yours? So I'm partially in agreement, and partially I want to push away a little bit, because I think that the reform community got distracted by the narrow window left open in Buckley on the corruption rationale and has tried to package everything through the corruption argument. And I think that one need not fall into the trap of saying money doesn't matter. Clearly it does matter. Organization is expensive at every level. It's hard to get off the ground as a candidate without an initial expenditure of funds. Yet at the same time, one can also think that maybe the problem is not the money that's there, but where the money is. That's the significant issue. So if you look at the narratives that were put forward before the election, it was on one side largely the problem is Citizens United. The problem is that the wealthy control, whoever gets the most money from corporations, from certain kinds of vested interests, is going to dominate. And one of the candidates had pledged to have as a seal of approval on any Supreme Court nominee a commitment to overturn Citizens United. That didn't resonate as a political matter, but it dropped out altogether from the discussion after the election, because it turned out that the better funded presidential candidate lost, as had the better funded presidential candidates during the primary season. The question is, to go back to the theme that was picked up this morning, is where the money is. And I think that we have unfortunately institutionalized three critical events over the last 20 years, one of which was mentioned this morning, which is a pair of Supreme Court rulings that actually were very damaging. The two Colorado Republican decisions in the 1990s, in which the court basically held that candidates are at risk of being corrupted by the parties, and therefore you had to put up a very bright wall, a very hard wall between candidates and the parties, thereby diminishing the influence of the parties. The second two events were more on-the-ground events. There was a lesson internalized in the summer of 2004 when John Kerry ran out of money, and it turned out you could run a perfectly adequate presidential campaign without the candidate and without the party through the form of private funds. In that case, it was George Soros running it through MoveOn. And then in 2008, President Obama not only made the decision to forego public funding, but showed that you could get a significant amount of money harnessing the technology for direct appeals to voters to raise funds that bypassed the party organization altogether. And that was the lesson that was internalized by the outside challengers this time, by Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, of how they would get the seed money for the campaigns, in addition to Trump's individual fortune. But Sanders basically did the same thing without an individual fortune. And so the three combined, the wall between the candidate and the party in terms of the funding and organization of the campaign, the ability of outside funds to basically replicate the party activity, and the breakdown of the need for the party as an intermediary between the candidate and money, all have pushed in the direction of whatever money there is being held further and further from the candidates and the parties, as was discussed this morning.
Well, there's a lot there, so I want to come back to some of those points, but let me go back to Rick for a second. Rick, you have been an advocate, and this is going to tie into something that David has worked on much of his career, and it ties into what Rick Pilda said earlier about the potential of supplying particular kinds of aid to parties. You have been an advocate of vouchers, both limits, overall limits, but also vouchers, some form of public financing to bring additional voices in and to compensate for whatever restrictions are placed on the supply of private money. Where, in your view, and David, you can then answer this on the state and local level, where in your view is the political will or the basis for the argument that what are increasingly viewed as scarce public resources could ever be feasibly argued to be allocated to the support of political campaigns? How would you approach that issue with the skepticism you're likely to greet on that, that's likely to greet you on that front?
So is your question more about is there public support for public financing generally, or about vouchers in particular?
Generally, and then you can go
All right,
specifically to
generally,
vouchers.
I mean, we heard the Ben Ginsberg move into his food stamps for politicians mode when he was asked about public financing. I don't think it's happening on the federal level. If anything's going to happen on the federal level over the next few years, it's going to be a further loosening of campaign finance restrictions, especially limits on party fundraising. I think those are going to be next to go, and then we may get into this later. There's a decent chance that a new Supreme Court with a new justice strikes down what remains of McCain-Feingold's soft money rules, which is going to put parties in bit. So on the federal level, not only do I have no hope for any form of public financing, much less vouchers, I think things are going to get much worse. But on the state and local level, I think the potential for public financing is greater, and the potential for vouchers is greater. We know that because we're starting to see jurisdictions such as Seattle adopting vouchers. And we're going to have to see how they play out in practice and whether or not they work as well as, for example, another alternative, which I like, although not as much as vouchers, is multiple matches for small donations, which is what New York City has, and other places have as well. The benefit of vouchers for public financing is that it empowers voters by giving voters the chance to decide, if I've got $100 to donate for political activities, do I want to give that to this candidate or this interest group or this political party? Now, one concern about vouchers, which Rick Pildes and others have raised, is whether it would be further fragmenting and create a situation where, if you're worried about populism on the left and right, as some people are from the last election, this is going to just exacerbate it. And I think one way of dealing with that, as political parties, is that we could say that some or all of the voucher money gets routed through the political parties. You could decide to give it to the Green Party or the Libertarians or the Democrats or Republicans. And in that way, you're still empowering voters, but you're also not diminishing parties. So I'm actually pretty optimistic not on the limits side, because I think the Supreme Court's going to move further against limits, but on the leveling up side through the use of vouchers in those states, especially those states and localities where these can be passed by voter initiative. Because public financing, if it's presented to voters, I think in a savvy enough way, is very appealing to voters. Much more appealing than it is to state legislatures or city councils that would have to vote for these things. David, do you want to speak?
Yeah, and I mean, I can, maybe there's some feedback on me too. Just this election cycle, there were several initiatives around the country, and whenever, reform got put, should I use this?
Yes.
I didn't get it. Okay. So when reform got put before voters in either new policies or resolutions, there are 12 million votes that were cast in support of reform measures. 4 of the 5 actual statutes won overwhelmingly. There were resolutions in Wisconsin on Citizens United to overturn Citizens United in 16 different counties. Even Paul Ryan's county won 86-14 to overturn Citizens United, statewide in California, statewide in Washington State as well. So when people get presented the opportunity to vote for reform, as Rick mentioned around, with the initiative process, they go for it. There have been 4 of the 5 public financing initiatives in the last 2 years have won, and they're actually beginning to be implemented and work well. In Maine, we went back to the ballot last year in Maine to upgrade the system from a previous law that was passed in 1996. A generation had already passed, and we saw a dramatic uptick in the number of candidates that were participating in the system, even though there were still independent expenditures, and even though there, campaigns were being waged through party expenditures. I do like the idea of incentivizing a lot more small donations into political parties, a lot more access for parties to have resources to support their candidates. And if we do that, there are policies that, like Professor Spencer Overton have promoted, that we could drop that coordination line between parties and candidates if that money is coming from lots and lots of individual donors. If we allow that coordination line to be dropped, but the money is still coming from large contributions, then we do risk the problems that we see in a variety of places where big money really calls the shots.
Well, let me move from that and then pick on Sam a little bit on this point. So Sam, you have 2 people on your left who, and Rick Pildes before them in the previous panel, who thought providing financial aid, public support to the political parties would be a good thing. But you also have evidence that more and more people are disaffiliating from the 2 political parties. In particular, in the millennial cohort, there's less enthusiasm for the political parties than, say, certainly among senior citizens and cohorts above them. Why then, as a public policy matter, should money be allocated to parties if parties don't at the moment attract a declining level of political support and loyalty in the electorate?
Well, I think the question is in what form it's given to the parties. If you look at the experience of other democratic countries like Western Europe, where the political parties had always enjoyed a mass base, either in the trade unions for the social democratic parties or in the small business confederations for the Christian democratic parties, as soon as the parties started to lose their mass base, they increasingly tried to use their parliamentary advantage to secure public funding, which meant to give a subsidy, a welfare system for politicians who had lost the faith of their flock. And that seems to be a bad system, or it seems to be a system that locks in a sclerotic set of parties just at the point that they've lost mass support. So I like the idea of using the parties as the channel through which any funding flows, but to make the funding dependent upon their ability to engage and to get support. So if you look at countries that have, for example, undertaken public provision of TV time, so that you take that out of the money area, just, of course, that's chasing yesterday's technology with today's methods, but leave aside that whether it's the exact right way to do it. You look at countries like Brazil or like Argentina or like Mexico, and they apportion, or Spain, they apportion TV time depending upon your success in the last elections. And then there's a lottery system for additional slots so that new parties, new entrants can come in, and it's not just a freeze out of any new claimants for political power. I like the idea of funding being tied to small donations, because that's a way of rewarding or incentivizing the relationship between the population and the political parties. But the question is, where do you want the money to go? And that's a separate question from how much and how it gets there. If it does not go to the parties, there is no evidence whatsoever that the small donation or this kind of private funding is conducive to a healthier brand of politics. There's every reason to believe that candidates needing to raise funds on their own will pitch to the extremes, because that's what you pay attention to. A salient, striking, shrill ad is more likely to arouse passion and to get donations than a well-composed, moderate, boring, center-of-the-road type appeal. And so unless you have a strategy that, in my view, includes the mediating institutions, I have no confidence whatsoever that any of these mechanisms will improve the quality of either governance or the political engagement.
Well, then, let me ask Rick Hazen this question. Rick, you said the campaign finance reform might be predicated on promoting an appropriate vision of political equality. Sam is suggesting that there's an additional potential driving force behind policy, or a shaping influence on policy, and that would be to try to arrive at a healthier political system, a system in which dialogue is civil, informative, and whatever. Are you comfortable that we can entrust to legislatures the judgment of how to shape rules that make politics healthier?
Well, first of all, I trust the voters, and so in places where there's the initiative process, I would trust the voters to make those kind of judgments about those trade-offs. I'm not a big believer that we're going to be able to use campaign finance rules or other rules to create more deliberation and thoughtfulness in our politics. I think we're at a point where polarization is such that we can't use the lever of campaign finance to deal with that. I think the biggest impediment to that kind of problem is our system of divided government and what's led to this kind of gridlock. And in fact, looking forward to the next Congress, where you're going to have Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, and a Republican president, and soon what I would call a Republican Supreme Court. One of the advantages of such a system is that voters will be better able to decide whether or not they like the output that comes from a Republican government, and then reject it if they don't. Now, of course, they can't reject the Supreme Court, but they can reject the other branches. And so I think what we've had now has been a system of gridlock where Democrats could blame Republicans, Republicans could blame Democrats, and you couldn't get things done. This is moving far afield from campaign finance. But if we want to have a system where the government is responsive and actually fulfills the policies that people want, a system of more unified government where voters can look at the policies and reject them or accept them and keep those people in office, is actually one that I think will help our politics, not in terms of getting deliberation, but in terms of getting policy outputs that people can judge whether they like or don't.
David, on the state and local level, I have two questions about, Rick was saying he trusted the voters' embrace of these initiatives, these public financing initiatives. What, in your view, were the decisive arguments? How was it presented? And I assume it may have varied from state to state. And then the second question is, can you also tell us, because we tend to think of initiatives as sort of voter choice, what the turnout in those initiatives were?
Sure. I may not be able to answer the second question completely. Messaging, on these campaigns, varies from state to state. One of the themes that is pretty consistent is one of accountability. That people want to have an accountable government. They want to be able to hold their elected officials accountable. A second major theme is they want a legislature to look a little bit more like themselves. They want something that's more reflective of the community in which those legislators are pulled from and will serve. There's a lot of talk about whether or not to use the corruption language as a selling point for winning these policies. And the jury is kind of out on that. Sometimes corruption is a hot button item that you can press on and get people excited and anger, but it doesn't leave people in a hopeful place that there's actually anything to do about it.
So there's a lot of debate about that. It certainly tests off the charts in terms of polling, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to a variety of solutions that we think are ones that reform. In terms of turnout, we had a very strong turnout in Seattle in 2015 when we did a ballot measure there. Turnout was a little bit lower in Maine that year. Again, it's an off-year election, lower than we anticipated. And in this year, the initiatives that won, South Dakota passed a voucher system by about 52 to 48% margin. Washington State fell a little short of winning. There are wins in Howard County, Maryland, and in Berkeley. But over, across the country this year, like I said, there's 12 million votes were cast for reform measures in an election where there's a pretty significant anti-establishment message delivered by the presidential outcomes. This, we think, is an important lesson that the people actually will vote for policies and changes, dramatic policies and changes in the political makeup.
Can't believe that Berkeley passed a public financing system. Astounding.
actually-
A really remarkable piece of work.
No, they actually rejected one 10 years ago.
Yeah,
So
Berkeley,
actually,
fair enough, fair enough. Sam, just onto this question, because you raised an issue that's often raised about small donations and the notion that somehow democratized campaign finance through the internet and through small donations can mean a democracy that is perhaps less healthy than we'd like it to be. But the question is, how do we monitor for that? I mean, how do we decide what's robust democratic debate and what's unhealthy democratic debate? I'm thinking, for example, of one measure in McCain-Feingold that was designed to police debate a little bit, and that was the stand by your ad requirement. I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message that was supposed to have candidates have second thoughts about running negative advertising that they had to personally embrace. That doesn't seem to have changed much, the general tenor of political advertising in the United States. So what hope, even if we'd adopted the notion of a healthier polity, what confidence would we have that changing the rules or tailoring the rules to that objective could be successful?
Well, it depends what success is. And here I'd like to disagree a little bit with Rick on the effect of the campaign finance laws. I don't think we can expect that a change in campaign finance laws will quickly change what works in the public domain. So if tweets work, people will tweet, and if you have 140 characters, you will put your biting killer line about the negative of the other, because that's all you can really get across in that space. But I think that the cumulative effect of the division of parties from candidates and the growing inability of the parties and the candidates to raise funds on a level competitive with the outside groups does have an impact on our politics. It has an impact in two ways. First of all, the parties are weaker, which means that their coordination function in governance is diminished. And so our governmental institutions are unable to deliver public goods the way that they were when you could cut deals. And so one of the bizarre, interesting proposals that's going on that's in front of us right now is bringing back earmarks. And I used to think that this was the height of corruption, private money to each congressional representative to deliver to his or her district. It turns out that gets them in the game of needing to cooperate a little more with cutting deals, and it may be a small price to pay for more effective capacity to govern. And if you diminish the money being the fuel for the centralizing, mediating functions of the parties, then money will simply reinforce what we have and probably push to the margins. And it doesn't much matter to me whether the money comes from the polar big donors who are far from the center as it stands, or whether it comes from the polar small donors who are likely to be mobilized along the same kinds of catchphrases and more ideologically rigid positions or single issue positions. So I think that I'd like to direct this back to what's the aim of this. I don't want to civilize discourse. Be angry, hate the other side. That's good, that's healthy. It's been the history of our country. You want to get passionate. Slavery's wrong, goddammit. It's like, oh yes, I think it would be terrible to keep them in bondage. What kind of crap is that? Fight them on this. That's good, but do it through institutions that can then deliver public policy as a result, and not through showboats.
I should mention, just for the record, the Vice President earlier thought we should disagree, but maybe not hate the other side.
You know, I've been around you too long, Bob. You know, it's harder. But
Just a note. Rick, with the Supreme Court, let's just talk for a minute before we turn to audience questions about the Supreme Court. So you're obviously not optimistic about what the next addition to the court will mean for campaign finance jurisprudence. The Buckley Court, however, the existing jurisprudence looks unfavorably on the inequality rationale. How would you reformulate that? If you had a court that was open to it, if it was listening, what would you say to that court would be the basis for an inequality rationale that had a limiting principle in it that didn't permit Congress, in the name of inequality, to basically promulgate the most wide-ranging rules it could?
Yeah, it's a perfect academic question because there's no way the court is going to move in that direction. It's going to move in the opposite direction. Not when Justice Scalia's replacement comes on, because then the court will be 5-4. But if one of the liberals leaves the court in the next few years and is replaced, and then I think things could move further. We've been calling for the demise of Buckley's going to die. We've been saying this for 40 years, and it's still standing. The question is going to be whether these cases that are coming up, like the soft money case that will be before the Supreme Court to possibly take within the next few months, will provide the avenue for a nail in the coffin. But in an alternative world, which is what you asked me about, then I would say that the accepting political equality as an interest that could justify some campaign finance limits is no different than accepting corruption as a reason to impose some campaign finance limits, and that if you subject this to strict scrutiny and you require that the courts ensure that there remains robust political speech and avenues for speech, then I think that is the limiting principle. So I would not think that limits alone would be constitutional without some kind of voucher system or other way of ensuring that there are multiple voices and people can get their points across.
We are at question time, and a reminder to those that if you have questions, there are people stationed on the side, and they have little cards. You can write them out and send them on in. And let me stay in the alternative universe for just a second, because one of the questions was, there are concerns about equality of voice sufficient to justify policies that would subsidize some voices or encumber others. And what would the Supreme Court, would this pass constitutional muster? This is an alternative universe. Thoughts?
David,
So I think we could subsidize all voices, right? I just think it's, when you think about this alternative universe, it's actually not that far away, even though it's like in Seattle and in Maine. It's actually in this country. And so you have candidates like Lorena Gonzalez, who on January 2nd will begin collecting $25 vouchers from people who will be mailed these $25 vouchers from the city of Seattle. That she will be running for office on the basis almost entirely of these small donations that every single registered voter in this city will get. That's not diminishing anyone's voice. That's making sure that everyone has a chance to be heard. And so when we think about that alternative universe in the future of campaign finance reform law, it actually looks a lot different than this panel, right? Because it will be much more multicultural, much more diverse, much more reflective of the rest of the country. And that's what's exciting about the possibilities. Now, how that stands in front of the courts is incredibly important questions. And I think my colleagues to my left and to my right are going to be much better suited because they're experts on the constitutionality of this. But as a political and practical matter, if we're not moving in that direction, then we're missing the opportunity to participate our way out of this problem rather than try to prohibit activities we don't like.
I think these programs work reasonably well at the local level as seed money. There is no evidence that they scale. There is no evidence of a public commitment to the kind of funding necessary to run a serious national campaign for the leadership of the central government of our country. And so it's well and good to experiment at the local level. That's exactly why we have this concept of the laboratories of democracy. That's as it should be. But if you're talking about the big show, it's just not going to happen. We had a public finance system for President of the United States until Bob BAUER broke it, and it didn't work. It didn't have enough money. You couldn't run a campaign, and the public commitment, even when the Federal Election Campaign Act was established, was to set the amount at 2/3 of what George McGovern had spent in 1972 in what was the most disastrous presidential campaign of all time. And so many people who run for president, here's a little secret, actually want to win. And they don't want to reproduce 2/3 of the successes of McGovern, which I think means just Boston and its suburbs or something of that sort. It's just not the way that our politics has been organized. So in my view, where this has led, as in the Arizona case that went to the Supreme Court, is the recognition that there's not enough public funding for this, so you couple the public funding with an attempt to dampen down other voices or other sources of funds. And that's what's been constitutionally problematic. And it would take, I think, a number of votes on the Supreme Court to get that to be approved, the idea that you can silence speech in the name of supporting other speech. I think rhetorically that's where Scalia was at his strongest in this area, but constitutionally as a doctrinal matter, that's where he had the biggest foundation.
Bob, would you like equal time to respond? You're fine. And did you want to add anything at this point, right? Okay, the next question is that one of the panelists this morning, David Keating, posited that there's no evidence that contribution limits reduce political corruption or increase trust in government. Do you all have a reaction to that comment from someone steeped in campaign finance and campaign finance reform?
I think the trust in government question is a tricky one, and I know that Nate personally has looked at it, and I think that the public doesn't generally pay enough attention to campaign finance to have a sense of exactly how things work, but they believe that everything is corrupt. And I think it was after McCain-Feingold, corruption, views of corruption went up. So to the extent we're talking about the public's perceptions, I think there's some validity there. In terms of no problem with corruption from large contributions, well, if I could give $10 million directly to a candidate, I think that the kind of influence I would have over that candidate would be much, much greater than the kind of influence someone who doesn't have that kind of money to give. We might call that corruption. I would tend to call that a problem of inequality, but there's no question that it creates a system where those with the greatest wealth have the most ability to influence not who's elected, but what public policies are favored. And I think that's very problematic, whether we call that corruption or we call it something else.
I had one thing on that.
Yep.
Look, you have to compare reality to reality. So the question is not whether if you give $10 million to a candidate, that's going to get your phone call answered. The question is it worthwhile to give the $10 million to the candidate instead of going through the facade of giving it to a super PAC named after that candidate, which is the way it's handled right now. So whether it's more or less corrupting, it's really hard. I go back and forth on this, because if you give $10 million to the candidate directly and it is transparent, and that's something we would have to enforce, but if it is transparent, then there's an accountability for having taken those $10 million, where if you launder it through an LLC and it goes into the super PAC and there's no identification, or it goes into the 501c6, there's no identification of the institutional backing of the money or the individual backing of the money, and there's no apparent accountability of the candidate for it, I think we're probably in the worst of all worlds right now. So yes, if everybody had the same amount of money to give, that's one thing, but That's not the world we live in right now. And I thought that the question, the comment this morning was really directed at maybe it's time to liberalize the money going to the actual players in the system.
All right, this is the last question for this panel, and it's somewhat of a curveball. And I ask it only because I got a handful of questions for this morning's panel on the same subject. It's the Electoral College. And I encourage you, if you wish, to take the law school pass rather than answer. But the question is that in keeping with the themes of inequality, what do you think about Professor Lessig's argument that the Electoral College votes should be cast proportionately or in some other different ways, or, as I heard this morning on a number of questions, gone? No more Electoral College.
Can I take that? So I wrote an article 10 years ago saying that what's most troubling about the Electoral College is not the institution, but the allocation system for the votes. And so we have a long history of constitutional and statutory attacks in this country on at-large or multi-member districting because it tends to suppress minority votes. So if you're a Hispanic voter in Texas and there's reasonably polarized voting between Anglos and Hispanics in Texas, it means that your vote goes to 0 for the Electoral College. Whereas we know from a long line of cases in Texas, both under the Constitution and under the Voting Rights Act, that if you had any other office in Texas that was at large at that level, any other multi-member office that was at large at that level, it would be unconstitutional or unlawful given a certain level of polarization of the voting. So that I think that the problem with the Electoral College is not that it's a distortion from pure democratic norms, and leaving aside Larry Lessig's always crusading idea that he's going to overturn the last 5 elections or some number of last elections. But leaving that aside, the problem is not that it's such a big departure. It's certainly less of a departure than the Senate from equal population. But the problem is the winner-take-all aspect of it is completely discordant with where our law has moved in the last 40 years.
And the last word.
Well, I'll just make a more general point that I see Lessig's comments as fitting into just a kind of liberal desperation to try to find a way to avoid a Trump presidency. It fits in with the Jill Stein recount and other aspects, and going back to the Never Trump movement, that people are looking for ways to get around the usual rules in order to get a political outcome that they like that's better. If Larry wants to litigate over whether or not the current way that Electoral College votes are allocated is unconstitutional, you don't raise that argument after the election's already been had. You raise that argument for the next election coming. And he's got 4 years now to try to litigate that. And if he wants to, let him go ahead. But you can't go back and rewrite the rules after the election's already been run.
So always forward-looking, let's say thank you for the past panel and ask our next panelists to come on up. Thank you very much.